The principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, states that, for everything that exists or is true, there is a sufficient reason or explanation for it to exist or to be true. The PSR demands answers to the question why. Why is this claim true? Why does this thing exist? The latter question is often associated with the phrase, nothing can come from nothing. The principle can be used to defend concepts like the origin of things, the meaning of life, and the existence of God. Before the 20th century, the principle was referred to as the fourth law of thought, coming after the three laws of logic. During the 20th century, it became less popular mainly due to the rise of quantum mechanics. More on that later. The PSR is a principle of both epistemology, the science of how we know things, and metaphysics, the science of fundamental reality. Here's the formulation in epistemology. For every claim that is true, there is a sufficient reason or explanation for it to be true. For example, this is an egg. Appealing to the PSR, we would ask, why do you claim that this is an egg? Well, it looks like an egg and tastes like an egg. This is my sufficient reason or explanation why I claim this is an egg. Note that this formulation of the PSR in epistemology is not controversial. Everyone agrees that every claim about truth should be justified by sufficient reasons, sufficient evidence or arguments. The controversial principle is in metaphysics. Here's the formulation. For everything that exists, there is a sufficient reason or explanation for it to exist. For example, appealing to the PSR, we would ask, why does this egg exist? Because of a chicken. This is the reason or explanation for the egg's existence. Whether we speak of the truth of a claim or the existence of an object, both demand a sufficient reason or explanation, which are found using induction, inference to the best explanation. See the video on reason for details. Now, notice that we use the terms reason or explanation when speaking of both truth and existence, which can be confusing. For clarity, we'll use the word justification when speaking of truth and ground when speaking of existence. To tie it to Christianity, let's provide an example in the context of God. Theists have a tendency to say, God exists. Yeah, we do say quirky things like that sometimes. In response, atheists have a tendency to ask, why? By asking why, the atheists are really appealing to the principle of sufficient reason, and this could be in two ways. In epistemology, why claim that God exists? What justifies this claim to be true? In metaphysics, why would God exist? What grounds God to exist? Or, sometimes asked in the form, who created God? We will try to answer both questions in this series of videos. The principle of sufficient reason in epistemology has already been covered in details in the video on reason. Let's now cover the controversial part of the principle, the PSR in metaphysics. Again, the principle states that, for everything that exists, there is a sufficient ground for it to exist. No brute facts, no randomness. A brute fact is a fact in reality that would exist without ground. A typical example of an alleged brute fact would be the initial conditions of the universe, like the Big Bang. Randomness means that certain acts or behaviors occur without a cause. A typical example of alleged randomness would be the behavior of some quantum particles. Again, more on that later. By the way, deniers of the PSR do not claim that there is no ground for anything. Obviously, chickens come from eggs and eggs come from chickens, but that some things exist without ground. For the defenders of the principle, everything must have a ground, no exceptions. We don't need to know what the ground is for everything. We don't know everything after all, but there must be a ground. Now, let's look at the possible types of ground that can exist. A ground can be either internal or external, no other possibility. An external ground is also called causal, as in cause and effect. Let's further subdivide all causal grounds into those that are causally determined and those that are not causally determined, or free. Again, no other possibility. Let's now give each type a name. An internal ground is called inherence or logical necessity. We'll cover what that means in the next slide. A ground that is causal and determined is called causal necessity. And the ground that is causal and free is called design. Therefore, there are three and only three types of ground for the existence of anything: inherence or logical necessity, causal necessity, and design. Let's go over each one. Inherence or logical necessity is the hardest one to understand. If a thing exists inherently, it means its existence comes as a package deal with its own identity or definition. For example, 4 results from 2 plus 2 because the numbers 2 and 2 are found inherently in the number 4. A triangle necessarily has 3 sides because 3 sides are found inherently in triangles. And should there be a certain being with inherent existence, then existence is just part of its identity. Another way to say the same thing is in the context of logical necessity, what is specifically called tautology. A proposition is a tautology when it is saying the same thing twice. For example, this bachelor is unmarried. X equals X. In the common language, repeating yourself has a negative connotation. It's stating the obvious. However, in logic, a tautology is more constructive. It is a proposition that is necessarily true under all possible cases, and it cannot be denied without resulting in a self-contradiction. Back to our examples. 2 plus 2 necessarily equals 4 because the proposition 2 plus 2 equals 4 written as shown is a tautology, like x equals x. A triangle necessarily has 3 sides because the proposition a triangle which is a shape with 3 sides has 3 sides is a tautology. Finally, our mysterious hypothetical being with inherent existence would necessarily exist because the proposition a being with inherent existence exists is a tautology. Causal necessity is easy to understand. It pertains to the laws of nature, laws of physics, chemistry, biology, etc. Given our causal laws of nature in the physical world, things that obey those laws exist or occur out of causal necessity. For example, when ball A hits ball B, the movement of ball B occurs by causal necessity given our laws of physics. When striking a match, the resulting burning occurs by causal necessity given our laws of chemistry. And a chicken always comes out of an egg by causal necessity, given our laws of biology, including evolution. Now, on to design. It may seem odd at first to have design as a fundamental type of ground. This applies only in the presence of agents with libertarian free will. If an agent acts out of free will, then the effect occurs not out of causal necessity, but freely. And to avoid randomness, then the free act must be ordered towards an end goal. For more details on why free will exists and why it is compatible with the principle of sufficient reason, see the video on free will. For example, when a free-willed agent makes a choice, the selected choice exists or occurs by design and with an end goal that motivated the choice. For instance, we may choose to go to work instead of staying in bed for the end goal of making money. And all things that are man-made also exist by design with an end goal. For instance, a paper cutter is a man-made device designed for the end goal of cutting paper. Thus, if free will exists, then our free choices and man-made things both exist by design. And so, there are 3 and only 3 possible types of ground for things that exist or occur: inherence or logical necessity, causal necessity, or design. We challenge you to find a single thing that exists or a single event that occurs that is not grounded by one of those 3 types. Now that we have described the PSR in metaphysics, it's time to defend it. In other words, let's find a sufficient reason to defend the principle of sufficient reason. We'll start by defending the principle on the epistemology side. Premise 1. Reason leads to truth. That's its purpose. We use our reasoning skills to determine truthful things about the world. Premise 2. There are 2 reasoning types: deduction and induction. And induction is sometimes also called abduction. Deduction serves to find necessary outcomes. If all A's are B's and all B's are C's, then by deduction, we infer that all A's are C's. Induction serves to find reasonable explanations. If it looks like a duck and acts like a duck, then by induction, we infer that it's a duck. Premise 3. Deduction is equivalent to the principles or laws of logic, and induction is equivalent to the principle of sufficient reason. Instead of saying, by deduction we infer that, we can say, it logically follows that. And instead of saying, by induction we infer that, we can say, the most sufficient explanation is that. Conclusion 1. Therefore, logic and the PSR are principles of epistemology. Again, this part is not controversial. Now, to defend the principle on the metaphysics side. Premise 4. Truth means conformance to reality. For example, the claim the Earth is round is true only if the Earth is round in reality, and if not, then the claim is false. Conclusion 2. Thus, if reason is able to find truth, it must be because its process imitates reality. On the reasoning side, we start with premises, and using our reasoning process based on logic and the PSR, we arrive at conclusions. Those conclusions are true only if, in reality, those same conditions described in the premises imply the same outcomes or grounds as those described in the conclusions. For example, for logic, if we have 2 spoons and add another 2 spoons, we infer that we will have 4 spoons. And indeed, this outcome occurs in reality. Likewise, for the PSR, if we observe the existence of an egg, we infer the prior existence of a ground, like a chicken. And indeed, we verify that all chicken eggs come from chickens in reality. While the specific ground is not necessary, for example, an egg might come from a lab instead of a chicken, it is necessary to have a ground. Conclusion 3. Therefore, logic and the PSR are principles of metaphysics. It is correct to think logically, because outcomes are always logical in reality. Likewise, it is correct to look for grounds for everything that exists or occurs, because there are grounds for everything in reality. We can summarize the whole argument this way. Grounds must always exist for everything in reality, because our voice of reason demands it, and it is its job to find truth. We give our voice of reason full authority in matters of logic. For example, we have never observed unicorns, and yet we are certain that 2 unicorns and another 2 unicorns will result in 4 unicorns. In the same way, we must give our voice of reason full authority in matters of grounds. Let's now discuss counterarguments and responses. We will give 2 counterarguments, one philosophical one and one scientific one. The first counterargument is that the PSR might be self-refuting. Is there a sufficient reason to defend the principle of sufficient reason? In other words, on the epistemology side, what justifies the PSR to be true? And on the metaphysics side, what grounds the PSR to exist? If no justification or ground exists for the PSR itself, then the principle is self-refuting. It cannot meet its own demands. Here's our response. On the epistemology side, we justify the PSR by the argument we have just provided. That's the point of the argument. On the metaphysics side, since the argument demonstrates that the PSR is a principle of metaphysics, and that metaphysics is about fundamental reality, then the existence of the PSR is grounded by inherence or logical necessity. In other words, the proposition, a principle of fundamental reality exists in reality, is a tautology. Here is the second argument. According to quantum mechanics, or QM, the behavior of some particles is random, that is, they behave a certain way with no cause. Since the principle of sufficient reason prohibits randomness, or demands that all behaviors must have a cause, then this fact contradicts the principle. We'll give a short response and a long response. Here's the short response. The quantum mechanics expert Richard Feynman says, I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics. To which we add, and something that nobody understands cannot properly be used as an argument for anything. We are not saying that QM experts are clueless or that QM is useless, but if the nature of quantum mechanics remains a mystery, then it cannot judge anything, let alone principles of fundamental reality. Here's the long response. Since quantum mechanics is about physics and not metaphysics, no cause means no physical cause, but a non-physical cause remains possible, and as such, quantum mechanics does not necessarily contradict the principle of sufficient reason. To understand this response, let's turn the argument into a syllogism. Premise 1. The PSR demands that all behaviors must have a cause. Premise 2. Some behaviors in QM have no cause. Conclusion. Therefore, QM contradicts the PSR. Alright, let's examine the premises. Premise 1 is true. A behavior without a cause would be random, and the PSR does not allow for randomness. Premise 2 is almost true. Since quantum mechanics is about physics, no cause should be rephrased as no physical cause. Phrased in this way, this claim falls under the authority of physicists, and we can accept it as true. But the argument contains a hidden premise. All that is real is physical. As this claim is about metaphysics and not physics, it does not fall under the authority of physicists, and we do not have to accept it as true. And as such, the conclusion that QM contradicts the PSR does not follow. This response is not trying to solve any mystery in quantum mechanics, nor is it trying to prove that non-physical things exist. It is merely saying that, since there is at least one possible solution, it does not necessarily follow that QM is incompatible with the PSR. To sum up, given that QM is not well understood, and that there are ways in which it is compatible with the PSR, we can safely say that quantum mechanics is not a threat to the principle of sufficient reason. In conclusion, the principle of sufficient reason is not only a principle of epistemology, but also of metaphysics. The fabric of reality does not stand on merely one leg, logic, but two legs, logic and sufficient reason. So let's bring the PSR back to its former glory as the fourth law of thought next to the laws of logic. When inquiring about anything in reality, we must make sure that it is not only logically coherent, but also sufficiently grounded. And the existence or recurrence of anything is grounded in one of three types: inherence or logical necessity, causal necessity, or design. In the next video, we will explore the principle of sufficient reason on the practical side by attempting to find an initial ground for everything that exists in the natural world. See you then, thanks for watching.